Hi, wherever you are listening to Ideas Untrapped podcast, where we talk to experts, scholars, and other social thinkers on ideas that can bring prosperity to some of the poorer regions in the world today. Hello everyone, and welcome to another episode of Ideas Untrapped podcast. On this episode, I sit down with economist Oliver Kim to discuss the complexities of African economic growth so far. We talked about the challenges surrounding industrialization and also discussed why Africa has struggled to replicate the manufacturing successes of East Asia. We touched on issues such as labor costs, political economy, and the global market environment. Oliver also shares his thoughts on the importance of state capacity, regional integration, and why we might have to rethink GDP statistics in development research. Oliver Kim is an economic historian and a research fellow at Open Philanthropy. He also writes the excellent blog Global Developments. I'm grateful to Oliver for talking to me on this episode, and I also thank you guys for always listening. Find a path that leads to prosperity. With every beat we march on, soundtrack for change. From dusk to dawn, united we'll stand in harmony. With every beat we march on, soundtrack for change. From dusk to dawn, united we'll stand. Welcome, Oliver, to the show. I've been a fan for a while, and it's fantastic talking to you. So thank you so much for coming on Ideas Untrapped. My first question to you involves something you wrote a couple of months ago, where you talked about African prices, which is always a puzzle that I've been interested in. So to restate it as simply as possible, we know that manufacturing in Africa has not grown as much, at least relative to other sub-regions in the world. And there are some theories or findings that suggest that it's because labor costs is too high. And there's a bit of a back and forth in the debates about how unique that is to Africa as a continent. So can you shed more light? Because you see a lot of comparisons, maybe Ethiopia and Bangladesh, the unit labor cost and how high it is. So is that really the constraints? What are the nuances, based on what you discussed in that blog post?
So yeah, just to quickly summarize, Africa has kind of missed out on, let's say, the manufacturing revolution that, for instance, propelled East Asia. So when you think of the East Asian tigers, China, to rapid rates of growth and poverty alleviation. And, I think in some countries, actually, the share of manufacturing value added or the share of manufacturing employment is the same or lower than where it was in the 1970s, immediately after independence. So from a developmental standpoint, this is kind of a bit of a puzzle. And from a poverty alleviation standpoint, it's a tragedy because this is the only sort of way that we know how to lift large numbers of people out of poverty in a rapid sort of fashion. That's how China did it. That's how earlier Korea, Taiwan, and Japan did it. From a prices standpoint, the problem that economists have identified is that labor costs are too high relative to the level of productivity. That's an important qualified statement to make. So, most developing countries are poor. As a feature of a developing country, one thing that's true is that incomes are relatively low, wages are relatively low, and so labor is relatively cheap. It's also true that if you're a foreign firm deciding where to site a factory, you don't just care about the labor cost, you also care about the productivity of the workforce. And so it works out that what you care about is the amount of productivity divided by the cost of hiring an additional worker. And on that metric, which is typically measured in something that's called a unit labor cost, so the amount that it costs to produce one unit of output, a lot of sub-Saharan African countries turn out looking relatively poor, especially compared to their peers, similar sort of income levels. So there's sort of two dimensions to this problem. One is the productivity side, and then the other is the cost side. On average, it appears basically that African countries have wages that are actually relatively high for their level of development. And so this becomes a further mystery, like why is this the case? One hypothesis that's been put forward in a couple of papers by the folks at the Center for Global Development is that it's because prices are too high. So this is like one step up the causal chain. If prices are high and the goods and services that are to buy cost too much, then you have to pay people a higher wage basically to afford that. Of course, the sort of factors behind this, I think, are incredibly complex. I think one major sort of historical and sort of fundamental feature that I would point to is that historically, labor in Africa and sub-Saharan Africa has been relatively scarce. So this is the contrast, I guess, with East Asia and potentially South Asia, where population density is incredibly high and labor is just constantly in surplus, right? So historically, China, East Asia is like one of the most densely populated regions of the world. The opposite is kind of true in Africa. Now the population has grown a lot, but historically, you just had actually a lot more land than people. And if you look at the deep history of African sort of polities, a lot of them were trying to economize more on people than on land. So like in East Asia and in Western Europe, you had states with very clearly defined boundaries, and political control was defined by control over land. In Africa, there are states, but there are also instances basically where political control was defined more by control over people. And so there was more fluidity in terms of like territorial boundaries. And so control basically of labor, potentially through slavery also, was a way of a political state to assert power. That's a bit of a digression, but historically speaking, you had relatively low population density. And I think that's part of the factor into why labor was relatively scarce and maybe why wages are low. So in the present day, maybe that's starting to change a little bit, but looking at the sort of deep fundamental factors, it appears that maybe wages are potentially quote unquote too high to enable a sort of African manufacturing revolution.
Yeah, maybe I read that wrong, but one of the things you discussed in that particular essay was the Hassan non-linear model or something like that. We proposed a U-shaped relationship between GDP and price levels, which, again, maybe I'm wrong about this. The conclusion that sort of came out of that this might not necessarily be a problem that is unique to Africa. So can you shed more light on that?
So let me talk about what I talked about in the blog post. So economists have this relationship. It's a purely like empirical one. So if you go out in the world and you observe things, it's called the Balassa-Samuelson relationship, where basically it appears that as countries get richer, prices of things like haircuts and services seem to go up almost more than proportionally, right? So like, if I go to Switzerland, which is a very rich country, a haircut costs like $30 or something ridiculous. Actually, it's probably more than that. It's like $50 or something, 50 Swiss francs. Versus, if I go to a kinyozi in Kenya or whatever to go to a barber, that same haircut, which effectively is not that differentiated in terms of quality. Like a haircut is a haircut. Like if I ask for a buzz cut, it's the same thing. It's the same product. But that product in Kenya probably costs $1 or possibly less. And so this sort of weird differential where richer places seem to have higher prices is known as the Balassa-Samuelson effect. And if you think about like the sort of underlying theoretical mechanism here, basically richer countries have higher productivity. Higher productivity shows up in like higher productivity in, let's say, like the manufacturing sector or higher tech kind of sectors. For like service sectors, which everybody needs, right? So everybody needs like barbers, everybody needs janitors, teachers, things that basically don't increase that much in productivity. Even these sectors need to face higher wages in these rich countries in order for them to be able to compete with the manufacturing sector, where productivity has gone up a lot, right? So like people can switch jobs, people can move between different sectors of the economy. And so the price basically of these service sector goods where productivity actually hasn't gone up that much have to sort of keep pace. And that's how you end up with this phenomenon where the same haircut, essentially the same quality, costs the same amount across two places with very different incomes. Now, the way that economists typically have thought about this is that there's a linear relationship. So if you drew like a scatter plot of countries by their income levels and their price levels, you'd just get something like a line. That's like the theorized kind of relationship, a linear Balassa-Samuelson relationship. By that logic, if you put African countries on that scatter plot, it looks like basically that their prices are too high. So they're lying above this line on the scatter plot between GDP and price levels. What I was arguing in this piece is there's some research, in particular a paper from the Journal of International Economics by Hassan, I forget his first name, I think from like 2017 or so, basically arguing that maybe this Balassa-Samuelson relationship is not actually linear. Maybe it's actually non-linear. Right. There's no actually like really strong reason that this thing has to be linear. It's just like it's the easiest model to write down. And this is like a common flaw amongst economists, is that you go with the first thing that's like easiest mathematically to do, and then you forget that it's just a simplification and you start to treat it like a feature of reality. But so he writes out a more complicated model where, as is true in the real world, there's not just like a service sector and a non-service sector, as I laid out just a minute ago. There's agriculture, there's manufacturing, there's services. Countries basically shift between these three things as they vary in their stages of development, right? Agriculture for a lot of developing countries is actually mostly non-traded. Think of subsistence farmers, people who grow like maize or soybeans for their own consumption. And so it's not the same as a big agricultural producer like in Europe or whatever that's just trying to sell to the entire world. And so you can think of those agricultural products as more like the services, like those haircuts that I was describing in like a European country. And so it works out if you do the math and you account for basically the movement of labor between these different sectors as an economy develops, you end up with something that looks more like a nonlinear Balassa-Samuelson relationship, like a U shape, right? So prices may start to go down a little bit as you move from a low level of income to like a medium level of income, and then they start to go up again. And so accounting for this kind of nonlinear Balassa-Samuelson relationship, maybe sub-Saharan African countries don't look like so much of an outlier in a global sense. Maybe this is actually just like a general sort of pattern of development that all countries have gone through, where their prices have started to go down a little bit and then gone up. And so maybe prices are not the reason that African manufacturing has sort of lagged behind.
One thing I'm curious about, which I would like you to speculate on a little bit, is how these all relates to food prices. I know that maybe Tom Westland has done a little bit of work here on food prices and divergence in Africa. It's hard to generalize for the entire continent, like you said, but for example, in Nigeria, food inflation is currently 40%. It's been double digit for about a decade. If you further break that down into what actually households spend money on, it's mostly food, right? So, like, we have these higher prices, which then feeds into higher wages. What is the relationship to the sort of inability of some African economies to achieve agricultural productivity enough to bring down food prices?
Yeah, so this is an incredibly complex issue. I think it plugs into the political economy, I think, of a lot of sub-Saharan African states. So the most famous book on this kind of subject is Robert Bates's Markets and States in Tropical Africa. And it's a very slim book, but I think it's a remarkably powerful set of like analytic tools for thinking about this stuff. So let's take a step back. Most developing countries, not even just African countries, but most developing countries, what do they have to produce? They have agriculture, right? Most developing countries, most people are farmers. And, immediately after independence, again, not just African countries, but, countries in South Asia, countries in East Asia, all of them, they achieved their independence and they started to figure out like, what can we potentially do to start growing? And what sector do you basically have in order to finance development? If you want to import machines, you want to foster manufacturing growth, the only sector that you have is basically agriculture, right? And so there's this strong impulse basically to essentially tax agriculture to finance the capital imports and things that you need to foster manufacturing growth. There's actually a lot of pressure basically to lower the prices that are paid to agricultural producers to finance imports of machines and stuff from richer countries. This process happened not just in sub-Saharan Africa, but again, like in Taiwan and Korea, where basically the state imposed policies that actually had an anti-agricultural bias. The difference, I think, that Bates argues is that these policies became much more entrenched in sub-Saharan Africa, where basically the state had a lot less sort of penetration into the countryside, where the state was not as beholden, I guess, to the needs and interests of farmers, for instance. And the state basically became captured in a large sense by urban elites, who discovered basically that they liked having prices, particularly of food, which, as you mentioned, for a developing country is the largest portion of the consumption basket in a lot of cases. And they also liked, in a trade sense, they also liked having relatively cheap imports from other countries. So for like the growing sort of African middle class, for the elites, they liked imports of like European cars and like luxury goods and that kind of stuff. And so that favors an exchange rate that tends to be overvalued to make your imports cheaper. And that actually hurts farmers who are interested potentially in exporting, for whom an undervalued exchange rate would actually be the pro-developmental policy. This is maybe one point of divergence between East Asia and a lot of countries in sub-Saharan Africa, where you started from a very similar kind of logic, which is that you should try and take resources, pull resources out of agriculture to fund manufacturing growth so that you can have your own sort of industrial revolution. But those sort of policies that effectively taxed agriculture and made it cheaper basically for urban consumers became entrenched in places like Nigeria and Kenya because the political class and the governing elite became beholden to them in a way that was not true in East Asia. So that was like a kind of a tangent from your original question, but I think the political economy aspects are worth highlighting here.
You've mentioned East Asia a couple of times in your answers. It's become the model, the standard when we talk about economic development. I was telling a friend recently that ever since East Asia, the East Asia phenomenon, basically every country has been trying to make a miracle in terms of development. I mean, 2-3% rate of growth no longer suffices. You have to do 7-10%, at least in China. What was so unique about those set of states, Japan, Taiwan, Korea, Singapore, maybe to a lesser extent, Hong Kong? What was so unique about them and that time period that made it possible? Because essentially, I would say that no country has been able to repeat that level of convergence since.
Yeah. Unless you happen to be lucky enough to find yourself sitting on like a gigantic oil field. Though I guess that's also true that that's not even necessarily good for development. There's a couple of factors that I'd highlight. So the first, I guess, is like historical stuff. So East Asia, in some senses, unusual like Western Europe, in that it is like a long history of being organized, I think, along state lines. In some senses, like Korea, Japan, and certainly China, these are polities that like emerged before the emergence of states in Western Europe. And there's been a lot of research actually trying to understand how these states emerged without a lot of the same interstate warfare that characterized Europe like in the medieval and the early modern period, but instead through a process of Confucian learning, of an elite that was based around meritocratic civil service kind of stuff. Historically, this place is like a little bit unique, and it's unlike, let's say, a lot of sub-Saharan Africa, where at the time of European colonization, around 50% of the people were living in sort of polities organized as states. That's not a statement about like, oh, states are like better or more developed in any sense, but for the specific problem of if we want to do things like industrial policy or like agricultural policy, get growth to happen, it turns out that having things organized as a state turns out to be like a very effective sort of organizational form. Again, to go into the deep history of that a little bit more, is this was a rational sort of response by people who were living in Africa at the time, in part because of the relatively low population density. The places actually where you see the emergence of states in Africa, around like the Great Lakes region, for instance, or the Ethiopian highlands, are places where you had relatively higher population density. So in that sense, it tracks basically the broader sort of global pattern. Anyway, that's a long digression to say that East Asia is kind of unique in having relatively well-defined, strong states. And that kind of already solves a lot of the problems that I think a lot of sub-Saharan African countries are facing, where, essentially a lot of them are creations of European colonialists. You have a whole bunch of people from different tribes, different ethnic backgrounds who don't actually have a whole lot to do with each other, and they're lumped together in states that just kind of lack coherence. And so the 60 years since independence have been tragically, I guess, marred by a lot of the adjudication of these disputes. So, in the worst case, civil war, ethnic cleansing, that kind of stuff. But even in the best cases, a lot of distrust, a lot of competition over rent-seeking behavior, our turn to eat when our president wins election, that kind of stuff. So at a minimum level, I think states are probably like a necessary precondition for rapid development. The second thing that I would point to in a more near-term sense is that the East Asian states were at a critical sort of boundary in the Cold War, right? So like South Korea almost got swallowed up by North Korea. Taiwan was sort of the product of the Chinese nationalists losing the Civil War. And for the longest time, actually to this present day, they're worried about getting swallowed up by China. Japan was also similarly worried about communist takeover. And so that sort of enabled, I think, a set of policies that are also rather unique. The first one, obviously, is land reform. So immediately after independence for these countries, they conducted large programs of land redistribution. I think politically, this also helps. So tying into the state stuff, like having a broad base of support in the countryside where farmers are part of your sort of governing coalition. And there's an incentive basically to engage in broad-based agricultural productivity growth, not necessarily as a result of the redistribution, but because the state has penetration into the countryside and is able to do things like agricultural extension, spreading fertilizers, high yield varieties, and all this kind of stuff. Yeah, so land reform was like a critical policy that had to happen because across the border, like in North Korea, they have a land reform policy. In China, they have a massive land reform. In fact, because you were so unpopular amongst the peasants, that's why the KMT got kicked out of mainland China. And Japan also had one like in the late 1940s. So, that's just like one very critical example. Industrial policy also, the fact that basically a lot of these countries also received a large amounts of American military spending. That was directly related to the boundaries of the Cold War, the fact that the United States was fighting these wars, these hot wars, first in Korea and then in Vietnam. So it's difficult, I guess, to pinpoint a little bit, but the confluence of these factors, like the existential kind of threat, the fact that if you don't get your development policy right, you will just be taken over. In Korea, this was like a very real part of the thinking. It energized things like industrial policy, the fact that we need to create our own domestic steel industry so we can build our own like artillery, our own tanks and all this kind of stuff because we're possibly going to be invaded by the North. Yeah, the boundaries of the Cold War are, I think, an understated component of why East Asia took off.
Yeah, so I mean, it's good you mentioned Studwell, did you?
Not yet, but like kind of implicitly.
I guess we're going to get there at some point. So, ever since the publication of that book, How Asia Works, it sort of become the standardized, informal canon of policy advice in this sort of general sense, perhaps not in the technical sense, of what went right with East Asia and what you should do roughly. And one country that I think went full Studwell was Ethiopia, with the land reform, the focus on agriculture, the intensive focus on manufacturing, but it hasn't really worked out so well. So to the degree that you know what was wrong with how Ethiopia just sort of went about going Studwell, to use that phrase.
Yeah, there's a lot of different factors here. And again, I would not call myself an expert on Ethiopia. I've not actually physically been to Ethiopia. I've talked to a lot of like Ethiopian students here at Berkeley. So qualify everything that I say with that caveat.
Yeah.
I mean, it's tragic. I know that this like big manufacturing push was like already not yielding the expected results before the outbreak of the Civil War post-COVID. Yeah. That is just so obviously like a first order fact to point out that, you know, Ethiopia had this horrible civil war a couple years ago, and we're still dealing with the ramifications of that. It's very difficult, I think, to like try and do broad-based rapid economic growth if you just constantly have civil conflicts of this kind. The damage is obvious, I guess, from the pure human cost, from the number of people who died, you know, from the wartime kind of destruction, but also like whenever there's a stable sort of post-war kind of settlement, the distrust between the Tigrayans, the Amharas, all these different sort of ethnic groups is definitely going to shape policy. And that's like a common feature, I guess, of a lot of sub-Saharan African countries where there's always competition, I guess, over spoils rather than thinking about things that could broadly benefit people. And I think that's also partly a rational response. I should also say that even though it wasn't colonized, Ethiopia actually, I think, has some features of a lot of, well, it was briefly colonized by the Italians, but nowhere near a sort of penetrating kind of colonial regime. But Ethiopia itself was sort of a product and a response to European colonization of sub-Saharan Africa, where in literal terms, an imperial sort of project that sort of absorbed a lot of surrounding ethnic groups and regions to create buffer zones against European colonization. So that's the underlying structural reasons for why you have a state that doesn't have a strong majority ethnic group. There's a lot of conflict that's been generated by that. But even before the Civil War, as I mentioned, the sort of big manufacturing push was not sort of yielding the expected results. There had been pretty impressive, I think, overall aggregate GDP growth under Meles Zenawi, where Ethiopia was achieving something like rates of like 10% GDP growth a year. You can quibble about those numbers, but I think it is broadly true that Ethiopia was growing very fast. Most of that, however, was not turning up in the sectors that the state was championing the most, which were the big manufacturing push, to very explicitly copy the model of Korea and Taiwan and the East Asian tigers. Just to list some of the things that the state has done, I mean, the state has like invested in massive industrial parks, which are actually state of the art in terms of the facilities. So you have like the famous Hawassa Industrial Park. It has subsidized electricity for these places. So, you know, a common problem in a lot of sub-Saharan African countries that are trying to pursue manufacturing growth, you know, for instance, Nigeria, is that power is just simply unreliable or it's too expensive. Yep. As a manufacturing firm, you have to install your own generator. That's an incredibly wasteful and costly exercise for everybody to have their own generator. The state has been subsidizing electricity in those parks. It's building, you know, the Grand Renaissance Dam, this huge sort of project to lower energy costs more broadly. But even with all these massive explicit and implicit subsidies, the textile sector basically in Ethiopia has just like not been achieving the expected growth. One factor that I've kind of identified, it again has to do with these labor costs, where there's just like an incredible amount of turnover, it appears, at these firms, foreign firms who have cited in like places like the Hawassa Industrial Park, where workers will like turn up for like a couple of days, often their first sort of industrial job, so they're coming straight from like farming, and they'll find that they just really don't like it. or they'll find that conditions are horrible, they're not paid enough for their time, and so they just choose to leave. And I think this creates an incredible amount of churn, basically, where you never actually develop the skills to like get better at your job. The managers of the firm aren't able to identify like who are the highest performers and potentially promote them. And so it's this very low level equilibrium where you have this constant churn of workers who are not getting paid enough, who are very unhappy. And so the sector just never really grows. I don't know quite what the policy prescription to that is. Like one thing I talk about in my blog is like potentially things like trying to institute like a general minimum wage. So if, let's say, the wage is generally set too low, maybe you could raise it to the level where people are like, hey, this job kind of sucks, but I'm getting paid enough to stay around and do it. And maybe that would enable for skill development, would enable for managers to identify like the highest performers. But it is like a general problem. And it's a problem that Ethiopia, it appears, has not been able to crack yet. Unlike the East Asian countries, where the manufacturing sector was able to soak up a tremendous amount of labor that was coming in from the countryside. In Ethiopia, despite all these government subsidies, despite all this government effort to try and promote the sector, there just hasn't been a similar movement.
I certainly don't mean to pick on Ethiopia or Studwell here. But I mean, just to double down on that question and, emphasize what I'm really getting at. I mean, you can throw in a couple of scholars and public figures here, Justin Hodge, who look at East Asia and, extract a couple of things as policy advisors to industrial policy. State capacity is the big difference. You have to do land reform, which will bring us to your latest paper. Because what's certainly been true in the last couple of years, and I can point to your recent work, someone like Nathan Lane too, on industrial policy, is that even a lot of what went right with East Asia, there's a lot of nuance to that story than the generalized, simplified sort of model that we've been used to. So is there something wrong with how people are learning from the East Asia experience generally?
So what you described, like my paper, Nathan Lane's work, like this is historical stuff, right? Like we're looking at what happened in East Asia. But whenever you're talking about like development, there's like this additional inductive step. Like, are the conditions that exist in Africa the same as the conditions that were faced by East Asian countries in the 1950s, 60s, 70s? And the answer is like plainly no. The global environment, the global marketplace looks substantially different. So this is, I guess, the third set of factors I would highlight for why there was a divergence between East Asian economic experience and Sub-Saharan Africa's, which is like the environment in which the Sub-Saharan African countries are trying to industrialize is potentially just a lot less favorable than that was faced by East Asian countries. And this goes into things like global movements of prices, the relative price between commodities and manufacturers. So just to do like 10,000 foot view of economic history, during like the 19th century, this is work that's been done by like Jeffrey Williamson. So like the initial stage of globalization, it was actually like not a bad bet as a poor country, as a country like on the economic periphery, to be a commodities exporter, right? Europe was industrializing at the time, and factories were going up, manufacturing output was going up, manufacturing productivity was going up, and it was driving the relative price of manufacturers down. And so, if you were like an Indian artisan making a lot of textiles, that was previously the textile hub of the world. This was a tremendous competitive hit, and this was bad for you. If you were an Argentinian cattle farmer and you're producing cattle that, that fed people who work in the factories and this kind of stuff, that was actually a really good line of business to be in. And so, throughout the latter half of the 19th century, there was this kind of price movement where being a commodities exporter was good, being a manufacturing exporter was relatively bad, particularly if you were doing like non-sort of industrial production in poor countries. East Asia got incredibly lucky in some sense in that the period where it was trying to develop was very favorable basically to manufacturing productivity growth. Europe was basically starting to get richer. It was escaping, I guess, the destruction of the Second World War and the First World War. And so it was recovering. It was growing economically very quickly. And, as you grow quickly, you have greater demand for manufacturing goods. At the same time, Europe itself was starting to shift potentially more to the services, right? And so there was an opportunity for places like Taiwan and Korea to like start producing things that other markets would want, like TVs, radios, that kind of stuff. Yeah, the market environment that was faced by East Asia was like pretty favorable. Now, in the present day, the problem is that it appears that those conditions don't exist. In the West, actually, there's been a lot of development in automation that increases the productivity of manufacturing output. That's also true in the places that have claimed the mantle of being the world's factory, Korea and Japan, and certainly China, most of all, where you already have competitors who are able to produce manufacturing goods at a much higher productivity level than if you're a country starting out. And so it's no longer as easy just to like rely on the fact that you have relatively low labor costs, like the East Asian countries did in the 1960s or so. to sort of compete in the global marketplace. You actually need productivity as well. And if you're competing against people who use like a whole bunch of robots and machines in their production processes, it's just like very hard to compete on cost. And so I think there is a sense in which maybe these lessons are not as applicable as we thought because the sort of global context is just not as favorable to manufacturing growth as it once was.
Again, I'm increasingly skeptical and finding less useful some of what people say, especially when it comes to learning from the East Asian experience, because, oh yeah, people say stuff like do industrial policy, and once you run into the difficulty of doing that, it's because you don't have state capacity. And okay, so how do I get capacity? Essentially, it's reducible to get a different history, more or less, which is kind of not so different from the institutional people, which is basically just go get yourself a different institution, which essentially means you get yourself a different history. So I've become less enthusiastic about that sort of arc, which then brings me to the question, what is the right way to look at successful countries and learn the right lessons that you can then apply to your own context? I know that it's not all different. There are some similarities. For example, I know that a lot of African countries are extremely protectionist in terms of trade policies and shifting a little bit more towards export-oriented sort of trade policies would help. So, but as an economic historian, how do we learn from history?
Yeah, so this is where I would say that the label that I would wear is I'm a development economist, not an economic historian. Like I do a lot of economic history stuff. My primary interest is like, what can we actually learn to help people today? The historical interest is very interesting. It's intrinsically important, but what's motivating me is, what is actually useful? And I completely take your point. There's a sense, I think, particularly amongst academics, when you peel back the layers of the onion, in the end, it just comes down to, get a better history. There's just like fundamental factors that are so deep rooted that, basically you can't do anything about it. One answer that I give that's maybe a weird kind of like metacognition kind of point is that let's say you pose this question in 1945 or something, right? That's not actually that long ago. My grandparents were alive in 1945. I can talk to them and ask them what it was like. There was no way that they would have thought that South Korea, Japan would be as rich as, in some cases, richer than France or Germany. Like it was just like inconceivable at that point. I mean, Korea would have a civil war that would kill like 20% of the population like in 5 years. And so the cultural factors were broadly the same. The history, up to like 2,000 years, subtracting like 30 years or so was the same. But the transformation afterwards was just very difficult to predict. So I think there's a sense in which like when we're talking about these sort of factors behind why countries are richer or poorer, we have to remember that we're looking at them from like a very specific point. In 20 or 30 years, things could potentially look very different. And they can be very different in ways that are difficult to predict. One example that I like to give a lot is this is like a view that I'm less fond of, like cultural kind of stuff. Culture surely matters. But I think there's like a very strong instinct to want to say that culture is this fixed kind of entity, like these get a better history kind of arguments. It's like this sort of intrinsic quality that is tied to the people and just stays forever. And that's why you're rich or that's why you're poor. In the East Asian case, the answer that's often given by Lee Kuan Yew and others is Confucianism, right? Lee Kuan Yew became a bit of a celebrity in the 90s or so, just like going around different countries and saying like, hey, the reason that you're not doing well is that you have not absorbed East Asian values of Confucianism, like filial piety, studying very hard for tests, listening to authority figures, having a well-ordered society along these lines. But like if you go back 30 years, 20 years or so, scholars, sociologists, sinologists looking at the trajectory of China would have said that Confucianism was a terrible idea, that basically it resulted in states that were unable to adapt to the sort of conditions of modernity. The Qing dynasty was not a great historical success by any means. It completely failed to adapt to the pressures of Western incursions. And so like there's a sense in which I think our descriptions, I guess, of history and culture should be a lot more malleable than I think these get a better history kind of views. The thing that kind of gives me hope is that I think it really would only take one. I know that there's like Mauritius and maybe some other examples, but it would take, I think, only one sub-Saharan African country. I don't know which it would be. Maybe it's Ghana, maybe it's Kenya, maybe it's Nigeria. But it would only take one to start demonstrating, I think, this sort of sustainable pattern of growth for that example to kind of spread. That's essentially what happened historically in East Asia. I mean, if you go back even further in terms of the history, the chauvinistic Western view is, modernity was something that was exclusively a property of Westerners, right? Japan proved that very wrong, and that example spread to other countries in the immediate sort of cultural vicinity. I think the same process is definitely possible in Africa, and there's no reason, I think, that it can't happen.
So this sort of brings me to, I would say, my weirdest question yet. I mean, the reason why people talk about development, the reason why someone like me is interested in doing what I do is that I want Nigeria to be rich in my lifetime. It's possible, but maybe not. But certainly that's the hope. Can you imagine a possible future where, to make it as concrete as possible, where 90% of the global population would be around middle income or something we call rich? Like, can the whole world be developed, essentially, is my question.
I think so. I don't think there's any structural reason that's holding that back. I'm sympathetic to a lot of like leftist arguments. Like I know there's like core periphery stuff. Like if you're a big fan of like Raoul Prebisch, you think that the world is kind of underladen by the fact that, you have like underpaid people in the global south who are doing the commodities extraction or whatever to help the rich world. I'm sympathetic to parts of that thesis in terms of thinking about like why some countries are underdeveloped, particularly from a political economy standpoint. But I don't think in the long run there's any reason that all countries can't enjoy like a decent standard of living.
As a development economist, which you said was your preferred label, how do you think that development economics and some of the cool research and informative stuff that's going on there can influence policy more? Because that's sort of like a big thing for me, because I see more and more governments in Africa becoming so detached from what works, at least to a certain degree. So how can development research essentially influence development policy?
Yeah, the framing of that question is interesting. You were talking about earlier, maybe before we recorded, that your concern was that African countries, maybe not even just African countries, maybe like developing countries in general, they're not listening to the policy lessons that academics have prepared through their research. But my take, at least coming from someone who was very recently in the heart of the ivory tower, is that academics, even developing economists, which in theory should be like the most applied of fields, are not asking questions that are immediately relevant to governments and to policymakers in African countries. So maybe both can simultaneously be true. Like we're kind of like crossing past each other. But at least looking at the research production standpoint, when I look at what's published in top journals, often I'm just like, if the composition of development economists looked more like the people who are being studied, would we be producing the set of research? And my hypothesis is probably not. The framing that you see a lot of development research, particularly coming out of the United States and Europe, is very much in the mindset of I'm a donor, I'm an NGO, I'm an aid agency. What can I do on the margins to make my program better, right? How can I make it more efficient? How can I what intervention would work the best? I think that's like a perfectly fine line of work. For instance, my advisor's work, Ted McGill, he did a lot of stuff in deworming in Kenya. That has helped tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of people. Like that is like very clearly good to improve. But, this is not a critique that's new to me, but broadly speaking, the area that considers the framing of like, if I'm a developing country policymaker, what sort of macro policies, what sort of like broader industrialization policies can I pursue to sort of foster growth? I think that's a little bit more of a neglected area in terms of academic research. And so, yeah, I guess I would switch the framing a little bit where it's like the problem I see is also from our end. We need to be producing stuff that's informed more by experiences on the ground, like people who actually know the problems, and less about like what we think or what we can convince a grant maker is interesting.
What's the one idea that you are most excited about, that you are most enthusiastic about, and that you would like to see spread, become more influential? What is that one idea?
So this is a bit of an odd one. It's a very nerdy one, but it's like a question that has been bothering me a lot recently. Maybe you can also react to this. Is like GDP is like a number. I recently read like Poor Numbers by Morton German. Have you read this book?
Yeah.
Yeah. I read it like immediately at the end of my PhD. I mean, I've essentially done 10 years, 12 years of like economics research. And like I first heard of this book. Basically, the premise, it's almost like a sociology of how GDP is constructed in developing countries, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa. And it's not pretty. Like for those 10 years when I was a researcher in academia, when you go to the UN website, you go to the World Bank, the IMF or whatever, and you download the GDP statistics going back to like 1960, you kind of assume that somebody has done the hard work of like making sure that this is correct. There's actually an army of enumerators out there in Kenya or Nigeria or whatever. They've gone to every store and they've counted every capital good and they've done the math on this stuff. Morton Jervin's book shows is that that's just patently not true. Nigeria features prominently in that book. It's not even clear how many people are living in the country. The population censuses are like an incredibly sort of politically divisive thing. I'm sure you could speak more about that. Various ethnic groups don't want to be counted, or maybe they want to be counted more. That determines sort of the allocation of public resources. And so, you don't even have the number like of people in the country correct. And I believe it was like in 2014 or so. This is, I think, after the book was published. Like Nigeria basically did a revision to how its GDP statistics were calculated. That resulted in a revision that was like something on the order of magnitude of 90%.
We'll have to do another one very soon because
Yeah.
we're like the fourth largest economy in Africa now, and I'm sure a lot of people are not cool with that.
Yeah, Nigeria like spring vaulted past South Africa to become the largest economy. And like maybe both of those numbers are incorrect. Let's just say that one of them is like as a baseline. That means that at one point your number was 90% wrong. Like I think there's a sense in which like economists have been so focused on things like causal identification, all these crazy statistical stuff, ignoring like the basic question of measurement. If you had a thermometer that was like 90% wrong, like you would not read anything into the fact that your temperature goes up by like 2 or 3 degrees. If the error is like 30 degrees, it effectively is meaningless to be like making minute decisions. It's not the fault of a lot of these governments. I mean, in some cases it is, like maybe they mess with the statistics, maybe they underfund their statistical departments, but it is true that just like it is a hard problem to measure your economy. There's this anecdote in the book where Morton Jervin goes to like the Zambian statistical office, and it's like one guy who does both the census and the GDP numbers. And so like that guy is like really well intentioned. He's probably doing the best that he can. Zambia is like a country of 10, 20 million people, and you have one person doing all that work. It's just not conceivable that you could have an accurate sort of statistical product. So getting back to your question, Jervin's book came out. I think everybody like kind of cites it respectfully, and they're like, oh, GDP statistics are just not something we should have like a high degree of confidence in, but we just like kind of go on using them anyway. Because like, what else are we going to do?
Because it's just a caveat somewhere.
Yeah. The World Bank did some stuff. There's like a database they have of statistical capacity. So they rate countries from like 0 to 100 or something like that based on how good their statistical agency is. But like, again, I spent like 10 years doing development stuff and I just didn't even notice it. So one idea that I've been pushing that I hope to maybe put into a blog post, maybe develop it into a formal paper is like, we actually do have a way of kind of describing statistics that are very noisy, which is like, it's election season in the United States. You'll see like Kamala Harris versus Donald Trump polls. But if you're like a sophisticated consumer of the stuff, you always look for the margin of error, right? Like when a poll is reported, if the margin of error is like 5%, which is very common amongst these political polls, whether Kamala Harris is leading Donald Trump by 47 to 46 or 48 to 47, it's effectively meaningless. There's just too much noise in the underlying measure to like conclude anything from the raw number. And I guess one idea that I like to promote is like we should do the same thing for GDP statistics. For some reason, economists are willing to treat GDP as this very certain kind of metric without the appropriate degree of skepticism that they sometimes apply to other statistics. And so just having the margin of error printed next to the number, I think is like a good epistemic reminder to be humble and be like, hey, like these policies that we recommended that we claim boosted aggregate GDP by like 0.1% this quarter. Like there's actually no way that you can actually detect that. And so I think that should encourage greater humility amongst economists and policymakers about how much do we actually know about the world and how much can we actually affect it.
Not to mount any kind of defense for Nigeria, but I think since Morton's book came out, there's been some improvement, particularly in measurement, because a lot of it is just the fact that funding statistical measurement is not a political priority. So for a long time, and I doubt it has changed currently, for a long time, the National Statistical Agency is funded by the central bank in Nigeria and not even by the federal government itself. So, like Morton recalled in that book, when he came to Nigeria to do research on that book, the statistical agency was in the midst of a staff revolt due to poor pay. And the guys that head some of these agencies and try to do the work, they are real heroes because they are trying to basically perform magic with resources that are next to nothing. I know that, again, the National Bureau of Statistics in Nigeria, the United Nations is heavily involved, but in terms of funding and reviewing the methodology and improving the presentation and everything. But you would think that it is something that the government itself should be heavily invested in rather than a foreign agency or a donor agency or something. So a lot of it is politics, really, because in the end, governments really do not make decisions based on these numbers, and it's not really a priority to get accurate measurements. So, but I mean, hopefully things are improving, but it's not without controversy. The most recent one in Nigeria, for example, is that the World Bank and the ILO recently changed the methodology for unemployment, and Nigeria, again, just like the GDP thing, went from being 33% unemployment rate to 5% overnight. Right. So, and we started having these technical subcategories like underemployment and informal employment, and things like that. So it's politics, really. But I like your idea, and we'll try our best to help you spread it as much as possible.
All right, sounds good.
Yeah. So thank you so much, Oliver, for doing this. It's been fun.
Thank you, Tobi. Yeah, it's been fun.
For updates on new episodes, our blogs, our meetups, and so many other interesting things that we are up to, you can simply check out our website www.ideasuntrapped.com. You can also subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, or wherever else you get your podcast updates.
In harmony with every